Pronouns are she, her. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Children and Young People with Disability Australia, and we are the national representative organisation for children and young people with disability. So just a bit of a visual description for me. I have blonde hair, I wear glasses, and I'm wearing a black and white top. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians and of the land in which we're meeting in Australia. I am in the Alpine Shire and wish to acknowledge the Dodera, Waywaro, Waiamathong, Tongarong and Gunai peoples as the traditional custodians of the Alpine Shire. I would also like to acknowledge that in Australia, this was and always will be Aboriginal land and sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to acknowledge all the First Nations people who are joining us today and acknowledging people with disability who are joining us for this event. I'd like to also acknowledge Queensland Advocacy Incorporated, who in partnership with Children and Young People with Disability Australia are hosting this side event at the UN COS. So QAI is an independent community-based systems legal advocacy organisation based in Queensland, which is one of our states. And Emma Phillips from QAI is the co-host along with myself today from Children and Young People with Disability Australia. Unfortunately, we do not have sign language interpreters available for this event. However, we do have captioning available and please click on the closed caption option to make this live for yourself. But after this event, we will be making this video available with sign language. You are able to ask questions during the presentation through the chat function, which will be moderated. These questions will not be answered between presenters as we have a number of presenters today. However, we will have time at the end. I'm delighted that we've got a great line of speakers today, including 5 young Australians. It's so important that their voice for inclusive education is heard and that they are leading the change. We have a range of speakers with significant expertise in inclusive education and the young people who've experienced Australia's education system, advocates, academics who advocate for inclusive education. I would now like to introduce the work we've been doing to drive inclusive education in Australia. Australia has ratified international treaties, including the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that recognise human rights for children and young people with disability and impose Australia as a state party certain legal obligations, including the right to inclusive education. In September 2019, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities released its concluding observations following its review of compliance, Australia's compliance with the CRPD. Notably, the CRPD committee expressed concerns about the lack of implementation of many of the recommendations of the 2015 review of the Disability Standards for Education, the significant increase in segregated education, seclusion, isolation, and a lack of age-appropriate settings and insufficient funding for inclusive education in mainstream schools. And the fact that there is no national disaggregated data on students with disability, including the use of restrictive practices and cases of bullying. So the CRPD committee was very clear that Australia needs to lift its game to increase inclusive education in line with its international obligations. So we formed in Australia the Australian Coalition for Inclusive Education. It's a coalition bringing together organisations and young people with disability and their organisations that share a commitment to advancing inclusive education in Australia across state and territory education systems, including government and non-government schools. Our coalition is made up of a wide range of organisations, and we've recently formed a coalition youth working group so young people with disability can lead the change for realising inclusive education. In 2020, we published Driving Change, a roadmap for achieving inclusive education in Australia. a document to inform government and educational systems to ensure inclusive education and compliance with the CPRD. Our roadmap has 6 pillars. First pillar is ensuring inclusive education. The second pillar is phasing out segregated education. The third pillar is increasing educational outcomes. Then we have stop gatekeeping, and we have speakers who'll talk about that today, and other discrimination, eliminating restrictive practices, and preventing suspensions and expulsions. So today, each of our speakers, including young people and our advocates and academics, will touch on each of these 6 themes and pillars for change. The document also, which we will post in the chat, has a number of levers for change, which I won't go through today in the interests of time. Today, as I said, we are going into each of the 6 pillars of change. The roadmap, if you like, is a 10-year plan with short, medium and long-term outcomes to ensure the progressive realisation of inclusive education in Australia and compliance with the CPRD commitments that Australia has signed on to. So, inclusive education is the first pillar, which I'll briefly touch on before handing to the other speakers. Inclusive education recognises the right of every child and young person, without exception, to be welcomed as a valued learner and genuinely included in general education. It involves ensuring that learning environments and teaching approaches support full participation of children and young people on an equal basis, regardless of individual attributes or characteristics. To name a few of the essential requirements that we identified in the next 1 to 2 years that need to be done, is we need to see widespread and high quality teacher and principal professional development in inclusive education. We need the Australian government and state and territory governments to have agreed to an inclusive education plan developed alongside people with disability, experts and advocates. We need principals, teachers, professional associations and unions who are advocating for all elements of inclusive education and no further investment in segregated education. Families also need to have robust, transparent and independent complaints mechanisms when their child does not experience inclusive education. And sadly, that is the case in many times in Australia. Finally, we need all parts of the system, unions, teachers and principals associations, singing from the same song sheet to advance inclusive education and not to continue to other and discourage children and young people from being included equally alongside their non-disabled peers. I would now like to introduce a young person on the panel today, Tim Chan, who will discuss his lived experience of education in Australia.
My name is Tim Chan. I use he, him pronouns. I am a non-speaking young person on the autism spectrum. Non-speakers often face enormous hurdles to access educational opportunity, and my experiences have been no different. Non-speakers often face enormous hurdles to access educational opportunity, and my experiences have been no different.
I was diagnosed at 3 with autistic disorder. I did not develop speech despite years of intervention and speech therapy. I picked up typing with assistance to communicate when I was 9 years old, and through much practice, have been able to use this method to participate in mainstream primary school and engage in activities. On graduating from primary school, I enrolled in a mainstream high school. The high school was huge, causing sensory and overload challenges in addition to my high levels of anxiety. But the major stumbling block involved communication. Despite a meeting at school prior to starting Year 7 where I demonstrated my typing to talk, the school deemed that assisted typing was controversial and refused to allow this mode of communication. Furthermore, the school did not give permission for my teacher's aide to undergo training to support my typing in Years 7 and 8, and my voice-generating device sat at her desk for the entire school day. Because I could not type, I was unable to participate in any classwork. I was often in the library or a tutorial room with the aide doing kindergarten type work like coloring, letter and number recognition and counting. I was also actively discouraged to participate in excursions, school camp and other events. In addition, the school gave explicit messages to my mum to consider dual enrollment with the special school, or to go to another school. Without the means to type to communicate, it was enormously frustrating in not being able to express myself or connect with people. Furthermore, the lack of acknowledgement of me as a person led to an overwhelming sense of social isolation, alienation and loss of self-confidence. It became really difficult to step into the school gate in the morning, knowing that I would be non-communicado and mostly invisible to people. After 6 months of living with a crippling sense of isolation and powerlessness, I developed clinical depression and anxiety-related obsessions requiring psychiatric intervention. I even had intermittent thoughts of self-harm. I spent the next 6 years under the care of a child psychiatrist. Luckily, I was supported during this time by my family who never gave up on me, and advocates who pushed for reasonable adjustments. After strenuous negotiation from my team of disability advocates, consultants and family, I was finally given permission to type with my aide in mid-year 9. By then, I had lost much of my zest for learning. However, I tried my best to work in class. On the other hand, it was easier for me to work at home in a quiet and familiar space, but the school made further stipulation that any work I didn't do with my aide at school would not be counted in assessment. So my homework efforts with Mum's facilitation were not taken into account. This subtle form of discrimination excluded me from the right of working at home like the rest of the class, making it difficult for me to do my best work. The barriers to inclusion for students with little or no speech often come from a lack of understanding of our complex communication needs. Augmentative and alternative communication has been recognized as a valid mode for self-expression. Without this means of communication, we cannot engage with learning in mainstream settings and develop to our full potential. Thank you.
I would like to hand over to our next speaker, Cartier.
Thank you, Tim, and good day to you all, or perhaps good evening, depending on where you are at the moment. My name is Katya Malcolm. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an advisor for All Means All, the Australian Alliance for Inclusive Education, a member of the Australian Coalition for Inclusive Education. It's an honour to be part of this event, and I am joining you all from Perth, Western Australia, Jock Young country. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of lands around the world and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. The second pillar of the roadmap for achieving inclusive education in Australia is phase out segregation. Segregation has been an enduring theme in the global struggle for disability rights. As CRPD Committee Vice Chair Rosemary KS recently stated at a public hearing of Australia's Disability Royal Commission, it is important that we understand that the CRPD is about addressing segregation on the basis of disability. The CRPD committee, in its general comment number 4 on the right to inclusive education, has defined segregation as occurring when the education of students with disabilities is provided in separate environments designed or used to respond to a particular or various impairments in isolation from students without disabilities. This definition clearly captures special schools as well as special classes for students with disabilities and special units in mainstream schools. The committee has expressly characterised segregation as a discriminatory practice and called on countries to end segregation within educational settings. Paragraph 39 of the general comment further provides that the full realisation of Article 24 is not compatible with sustaining 2 systems of education, mainstream and special segregated education. Australia, despite its ratification of the CRPD over a decade ago, continues to operate a dual-track system of mainstream and segregated education. The Roadmap for Inclusive Education recognises that dismantling this dual system architecture is critical to the realisation of the human right to inclusive education and outlines a strategy to not only arrest the growth of segregated education in Australia, but also to phase out all segregation over a 10-year period. It proposes a range of outcomes using levers such as law and policy reform and capacity building for stakeholders in the education system. So in the first 1 to 2 years, it proposes that governments cease new enrolments of students entering the first year of primary school into special schools or special units or special classes in mainstream schools. Adopt evidence-based teaching practices to support inclusion of all students, support teachers and families, and commission appropriate research to support the implementation of inclusive education. In addition, there should be a ceasing of new investment in segregated infrastructure and a plan and monitoring of the transition of students and staff out of segregated education settings. Critically, people with disabilities, and especially young people with disabilities, must be involved in the co-design of all these processes. The roadmap then envisages in a 3 to 5 year period that all new enrolments in segregated settings in primary and secondary schools should cease via a grandfathering method, and every child's right to inclusive education should be reflected in, protected by, and implemented through education law, policy and practice. And segregation of students with disabilities is to become understood as a human right and best practice and not a legitimate parent choice. Current segregated settings over that period are to be gradually repurposed for general student populations. The roadmap then envisages in the final 5 to 10-year term that there would be a consolidation of inclusive practice in schools with a corresponding decrease, and by the end of that period, an end to the segregation of students with disabilities within all school settings. Schools would be transformed to become universally accessible, welcome and inclusive of all students with disabilities. Key levers to achieve desegregation would recognise segregation as an unlawful form of discrimination and allocate resources into a single system. Driving change, a roadmap for inclusive education in Australia, is a clear and unequivocal call to governments and education systems to take the necessary steps to address systemic barriers and ensure education for all on the basis of equality and non-discrimination. I'd now like to hand over to Mel to speak about her experience in the next area. Thank you.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here today, to be able to spend some time with you. My name is Mel. I'm based in Sydney, Australia. I'm a product designer at a social enterprise called Higher Up here in Australia, as well as one of the board of directors with CYDA. But as a designer and as a social entrepreneur and disability advocate, I've always been passionate about design and technology and problem solving through the creative lens in order to help shape a future that is more inclusive. But I realized that passion could only get me so far. What I quickly learned was that we all need to be seen as curious individuals who wants to learn. Be surrounded by leaders who can teach us to embrace our unique perspectives. And more importantly, be equipped with the knowledge that will allow us to combine the technical skills and expertise in order combine our knowledge with our unique perspectives in order to work in the areas that we are most passionate about. And all of this is underpinned by education. It is exactly what education should be like. But if we take a moment to reflect, is our education system, does it currently reflect this? Access to quality education is a fundamental human right, yet it is an ongoing battle that we fight every day, especially in the disability sector. We hear many stories about the experiences of people with disability accessing education. Some of these stories are surprising, some of these stories are shocking. But these are the stories that need to be heard because that would allow for change to happen. Can you imagine an education system where we don't have to fight for inclusion, where unique perspectives will be embraced, opportunities will be created, and talent will be discovered? We're fortunate to be able to live in a country like Australia, which is rather well developed. And our education system here is also much better compared to other places. But we're also far from perfect. I challenge you to think about what access and inclusion means to you. Is it simply just about having wider door frames, ramps, and lifts in our physical environment? Because that's probably what our accessibility guidelines would tell us. But that's not enough. It's also about our attitude and perception and our ability to go beyond compliance. There are far too many individuals with disability being denied education, stories that are left being untold, and changes being made without the voices of people with disability. Education has the power to create a platform where unique perspectives are acknowledged, valued, and respected. It can teach us to be resilient, courageous, and curious. And these are the three principles that guide my work as a designer and a social entrepreneur that are also reflected in my personal life. But all of this, it stems from the fact that disability drives innovation. If you think about access to inclusive and quality education, it emphasizes the importance of combining the power of knowledge with unique perspectives. The world that we live in today was not built for inclusion, but education has the power to change this. It creates a platform for us to be bold and to be brave, to step outside our comfort zones and to accept that it is okay to make mistakes, because that will only create more opportunities for us to learn. We know for a fact that education needs to be improved. Access to the physical environment needs to go beyond compliance. Our attitude needs to shift from special considerations to equal opportunities for participation and contribution. And we all need to accept the fact that we are responsible and accountable for making this happen. It leads us to empathy, and empathy leads us to understanding, and understanding leads us to knowledge. And isn't this what education is all about? Thank you. I would now like to hand over to Lisa.
Thanks, Mel. My name's Lisa Bridal. I work at the Community Resource Unit in Brisbane. I'm meeting on Yagara and Turrbal land. I started to learn about inclusive education a quarter century ago when my son Sean was born with Down syndrome. Through Sean, I could see the powerful legacy of inclusive education, as well as the gap between what is and what could be. CRU believes that children growing up together is a foundation for genuinely inclusive communities and the best way to deliver an effective education for all and combat the discrimination and disadvantage faced by people with disability. Today, I'll be examining the third pillar, improving educational outcomes. We want to see schools that are genuinely welcoming and flexible, finding ways for every student to participate and contribute, and follow the same valued pathways into further education, training, and work. To do this, we must see an end to segregation and to see students supported in ways that are consistent with the evidence. It is a painful irony that the students most in need of effective education, those with intellectual disability or more complex needs, are most likely to end up segregated and receiving an inferior education based on all available evidence. Currently, we have a lucky dip education system, one where some students benefit from impressively welcoming classrooms, where educators are routinely planning for everyone's participation and success. And for others, there is painful exclusion and practices which set children up for failure. To make progress, we urgently need a mind shift that says all students can learn, all have value. Recently, a parent shared her greatest wish. I would love it if just one person at the school saw my son as someone who contributes rather than an enormous burden. What commitment can we expect when students with disability are still too often seen as not fitting or at fault when schools struggle? Such thinking erodes any will to harness the creativity and flexibility that students need. And when families say their child not wanted or treated as a problem, many are too heartbroken to expect or advocate for high quality instruction. Inclusive education is not new. The research evidence on the benefits is overwhelming and spans more than 50 years. If we look to the research, we already know a lot about what works and what doesn't in lifting educational outcomes. We know that collaborative planning is critical, that co-teaching and peer tutoring works, and that by adopting universal design for learning principles, classroom lessons are accessible to the vast majority, the greatest number, reducing the need for individual adjustments and providing effective education for students with and without disability. We also know that common practices such as an over-reliance on teacher aides is not supported by evidence and indeed can be isolating for the student, deliver inferior instruction and damage a child's self-worth. Bobby, who graduated last year, says, "Sometimes I was treated badly. It was hard when the adult sat beside me. I liked doing the work myself. School would have been better if I worked with the boys. I didn't speak much if the adult was sitting beside me in class." So our supports must strengthen the bond between students and contribute to students being and having a sense of themselves as independent learners. Both pre-service and current teachers need access to good role models, developing skills by co-teaching with experienced and confident UDL practitioners, and having access to quality examples of how to include all students in the same curriculum. School leaders must support by allowing the time to consult and plan, and they must lead the transformation of school cultures, which would be boosted by increased numbers of teachers with lived experience of disability, and by an expectation that students with disability, including those with complex communication needs, have an essential voice on their own education and the reasonable adjustments that work for them. Families too should be treated as a resource and equal party, not kept at arm's length and only consulted in minimal ways when legally required. Deep, lasting change will only happen with a transformation of hearts and minds, when parents, educators and policymakers and more are prepared to stand behind a set of values about the rightful place of people with disability as equal citizens. Inclusion is every child's birthright. All children belong together. When everyone is there, educational outcomes are better, our classrooms are stronger. Our children and our communities deserve nothing less. Thank you. And I'd now like to hand over to Jocelyn.
Thank you. I'm Jocelyn. I am coming to you from Adelaide in South Australia. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land I come to from today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. So I'm Jocelyn. I am a young person living with a significant physical disability, and I am a board member of CYDA. I am wanting to share my experiences of education as someone that acquired a significant disability during my younger years. I grew up attending a local private school in regional Australia. However, when I acquired my disability, I was no longer welcome or able to be reintegrated into education, whether it be within my local private school or a public school. As someone who had significant academic potential beforehand and also after, it was really disappointing to see that this gatekeeping and exclusion occurring not even that long ago, and it still happens today. Disability shouldn't be seen as a barrier. Instead, it should be seen as a potential to increase the capacity not only of teachers at the school and the community, but also peers. Change within education around inclusion is really important for bringing that into society. It is also really important that every single person, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, has access to quality education. After all, education is a tool and a platform to ensure people are well prepared, not only to be able to reach their full potential within society, but it also expands their vision and outlook on the world and develops the capabilities that one requires to fight against injustice, violence, corruption, and many other elements of society. For these people that are already vulnerable, not only are they being not given the opportunity to meet their potential, the opportunity for education, which is the right of every single person, but they're also being not given the opportunity to access education and tools and growth that will support them in fighting the injustices they will experience as a result of disability. I think from my experience, as someone who wasn't able to return to education after year 9, which was already excelled, and the fact that I was able to go to university before my peers and succeed at university is a really eye-opening thing. People have capacity, people with disability have capacity. We need a system that will be inclusive and focus on their potentials and capabilities to enable people to succeed. So I guess for me, one of the biggest takeaway things would be we need to create a system that focuses on potential. We need to stop schools being able to turn people away. We need to ensure that regardless of capacity, regardless of ability, every single person can access education at their local or chosen education place of education. And I think moving forward, we need to ensure that regardless of where someone is, what someone's doing, or what stage of life, we start making these changes and implementing them strictly into education, both in primary and secondary education, to ensure that inclusion becomes a norm for society and that comes into further generations. So I'm now going to hand over to Bob for this next section.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Bob Jackson. Over in Perth, the land of the Noongar people. Okay, starting my video. Yeah, and I very much hope we can work together on reconciliation across the country. My main interest has been the inclusion of people with disabilities and the gatekeeping that's actually occurring. If we think about the Disability Discrimination Act that was 1992 and said all discrimination against students with disability is outlawed. Disability Education Standards 1986 clarified that and gave very specific information on what should be allowed and what is not allowed. And then in 2016, the Senate actually had an investigation of what was happening in education, and they received all these reports about children being both restrained, secluded, and all of those things that we've been hearing at the Royal Commission, but also a huge amount of gatekeeping where people were just pushed out of regular schools or just not allowed in. So to find out how common this was, we surveyed 700 families across Australia. That was all states, all territories, private, public, all levels of education or all levels of school education. And using those things that have been raised in the Senate committee. So we took 16 of those measures. They were either gatekeeping measures, which might have been as subtle as, well, I think your child would do better down the segregated school, right through to, we don't have those sort of kids here. And the other one was in terms of restrictive practices that cover the whole range of things from repeated exclusions, being locked up, restrained, etc. So on these, we asked people, have you ever had one of or more of these things actually happen to you? Over 70% of families reported that they had experienced one or more of those things. This is massive, because almost all of those 16 things are actually discriminatory and against the law. So we have a massive problem. The other thing that was quite interesting was that there was no differences. There was no differences across states. They're all the same. There was no difference between private and public schools or Catholic schools. City versus regional versus remote schools, no significant difference. School size didn't make a difference. There was a slight difference in terms of more likely to get gate kept and restrained in as you got older, but apart from that, there was no other change. And type of disability didn't matter. Even with children with autism, there was no significant difference. Everyone was copying this discrimination. So in terms of what we need to do about that, we've got to ask, why is this happening? How could that ever possibly happen? And clearly, there's no accountability. If parents do raise these issues, they raise them with the principal. If the principal says, well, you know, that's in your child's best interest. They go to the regional office and they send back to the school. They go to the regional director and they send back to the school. They go to the minister and the minister ignores them or tells them to, gives them a brush off. The only way you can do it is to take a discrimination case and risk your house. So the key issue is accountability. There must be some way that these people can be made accountable for breaking the law. And in terms of levers for change, the one that was raised by Mary earlier in particular is the independent appeals mechanism. I think is absolutely critical in terms of this. In America, there are several states that have got a situation where there's a tribunal that can make judgments, make a hearing the case, make judgments and enforce them. Now they can appeal that, the parents and the schools can appeal that to the courts, but it's very rare. people basically accept that this is actually there. And parents have got a chance. They don't have to risk their house. Secondly, also Mary mentioned the national data collection. At the moment, we have no data on the amount that this is the first data that's ever been published on the rate of gatekeeping in the country. Now, this should be coming out every year for every school, but it's not. The other thing we might like to think about in the short run is maybe starting to use the disability discrimination standards. There are these standards. One standard says you're not allowed to gatekeep an enrolment. Now, if we actually take that and say this and set that to the principle of saying this is the law in relation to that, and it is the law, how can you justify doing that? And I think we should be actually pushing the law right under their noses, because the disability education standards are much clearer and much harder to avoid in terms of the wording. Now, had that actually been successful in a couple of cases, so I think we should keep it in mind as an alternative. The other thing I think in terms of levers for change, and this is why I'm so excited about what's going on at the moment, is we're hearing the student voice. Now, this is the key, I think, ingredient which we've been missing over the years. It's the parents, of course, have been the ones who have produced the change, but it's the student voice that's actually going to, I think, really start to move the world. So I'm really excited about that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jock Young, who's going to talk about his personal experience and thoughts about eliminating the restrictive practices. So over to you, Jock.
Thank you, Bob. My name is Jock Young. I'm a Queensland lawyer, and I hope you are having a fantastic day. I have spent my entire life in the Australian education system. And I'm currently studying a Masters of International Law. I thrived in high school, have returned to assist students with disabilities as a volunteer teacher aide, and I have graduated from 2 law schools with distinction. This is why, from my perspective, I can honestly say I've had a predominantly pleasant experience growing up in Australian schools, as thus far I've had the good fortune of succeeding with flying colours despite my disability. When I was first diagnosed, a nurse told my dad that he could give up on any dream he had for me when I grew up. Naturally, my family did not take kindly for this, and we have spent everything we possibly can to ensure that this is not the case. Whatever I put my mind to, I compete on a level playing field. My parents were selective about the primary and high schools I attended, and as a result, I spent 12 years in classrooms where, from memory, I received fantastic support from staff members who genuinely cared about my success. Perhaps the most prominent example of this was in my senior year, when my teachers unanimously insisted I receive a laptop so that I complete my assessment to the best of my ability. Likewise, I chose my university because it is a fantastic special education department. I cannot imagine what law school would have been like if I didn't have the access to the services they provided. From my very first online test, I received all of the reasonable adjustments I received from high school, in addition to 2 computer monitors, a height adjustable chair, and 10 minutes worth of rest break, which I was actively encouraged to exploit. For 3.5 years, they had my back, and while studying my master's, they still do. Admittedly, yes, I've encountered days when the Australian education system isn't as friendly as my experience would suggest. When I was being interviewed for my high school, my mother, who works in special education, was told that I would be better off learning at the high school down the road, which, despite being built on a cliffside, which I accidentally dived over on my one visit to the campus, specifically catered for students with vision impairments. And until the administration saw my report cards, they were extremely reluctant about me attending. Moreover, my professional experiences exposed me to instances where students are treated inappropriately because either the teachers were inadequately prepared to handle the students' idiosyncrasies, or the administration was overly eager to use bureaucracy to stifle their capacity for learning and improvement. During my time as a systems research paralegal for QAI, I assisted with the drafting of the organization's submission to the Disabilities Royal Commission on Restricted Practices. It is therefore my pleasure to segue into this pillar of the ACI's roadmap change. Restrictive practices may be physical, mechanical, chemical, or derived from intimidations or threats. But whatever shape they take, they are always cruel, inhumane, and degrading. That's why I share ACI's hopes that in 2 years we have developed a system. I won't step on the toes of our next presenter. Speaking of which, I'd now like to pass on to Tamara Weiss, who will elaborate on restricted practices and her perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Jock. Hello, everyone. My name's Tamara Weiss. I'm a professor in the law school at the University of Queensland, and I sit on Yagara and Turrbal lands in Brisbane. I'm going to talk about restrictive practices, and restrictive practices are practices that have the effect of restricting a person's freedom of movement, where the primary purpose of that restraint is to protect them or others from harm. Now, some restrictive practices have already been discussed, so segregation and gatekeeping can be considered restrictive practices. So can expulsions and exclusions, which we're going to talk about shortly. So what I'll aim to do is fill in the gaps and talk about other restrictive practices that are being used in the Australian context. And I'll mostly talk today about 3 types of restraint: chemical, physical, and environmental. So if we start with chemical restraint, I think this is really the one that flies under the radar most in an education context. So chemical restraint is defined as the administration of a drug in an emergency situation to respond to a crisis. And in Australia, this is generally prohibited in schools. But one thing that happens an awful lot is convincing parents to medicate their children, or making children's access to education being dependent on them being medicated. And I can say from experience that the decision to medicate your child for behavioural reasons is sickening. When your child is medically well, it goes against every instinct in your body to administer a drug to them whose purpose is only to change or modify their behaviour. And that's particularly the case when you feel you can manage them perfectly well at home with other strategies. And of course, it's children with autism spectrum disorders and ADHD that are most implicated in this. And if we medicate them and essentially sedate them, then we can actually be depriving them of their unique strengths. Physical restraint is the restriction of movement of a child's body, so by holding them down, for example. Now, we can all understand a situation of an educator intervening to grab a child to protect them or someone else from imminent danger. But physical restraints are used much more extensively than that. They extend to grabbing or pulling an arm, or physically placing a child on a chair or forcing them into a sitting position. And of course, we know those things are done routinely in schools, especially with young children. We also hear much more commonly than we should about children being placed in cage-like structures or in repurposed cupboards. There seems to be this perception that if we fill these spaces with cushions, then we've magically transformed them into a best practice response to difficult or challenging behaviour. But we know that's just not the case, and some children experience serious psychological trauma as a result of being placed in these kinds of restricted environments with or without an adult present. Mechanical restraints are an extreme form of physical restraint, and that's where an object is used to restrain a child. Now, this can be through equipment or straps, but it can also be through restrictive clothing. And I confess, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the increasing use of weighted blankets. I feel that they serve the same purpose. Now, the complexity in this is, of course, some children benefit from and ask for weighted blankets. But I think in some contexts, the use of these kinds of restraints raises really profound questions about whether they're really being used in the child's best interest or whether we're actually using them for other reasons. It's environmental restraints, though, that are probably discussed most and brought up most in my research, and they're often discussed amongst parents. And these include some of the practices that we've heard about already. So practices of seclusion and containment, and of course that can include restricting a child's access to the classroom, having them educated in a separate space, or putting them in a sensory or chill out room that seems to be proliferating at the moment. It's also more subtle things, of course, like excluding children from excursions and field trips, from sports carnivals, from sports lessons, and also from camps. And of course, gatekeeping is another environmental restraint, preventing a child's access to the physical space of the school, either completely or by restricting the amount of time they can spend at school by mandating they can only spend certain hours of the day there or certain days of the week. The concern, of course, is that these practices can be used really as a matter of convenience in situations where the child could have been supported to participate. Parents express a lot of concern that by restricting a child's access to activities like this, their right to education is being encroached on, and also that the child is being dehumanised and debased by these practices. But I actually think there's even more to it than this. I think that by allowing other children to watch us treat children with disabilities like this means that all children suffer, and it very much influences the values that they carry through the rest of their lives with. The problem we have, of course, is that most of this goes on behind closed doors. And sometimes the only way we find out about it is when we observe it in our own classrooms, or if it finds its way into the media. But there does need to be an acknowledgement that all of this is very tricky and very complex, and individual children's needs will differ. I strongly feel that our politics shouldn't get in the way of making sure those needs are met. And as has been said by young people today, we need to be good listeners. We need to recognise that some strategies and environments work for some children and not others, and we have to be very responsive to individual children's expressed needs. And I think, as many of the panellists have said today, that that is what is missing from our approaches, the children's voice. In some circumstances, I feel we might be able to negotiate consent with a child to use some kinds of restrictive practices that they welcome. As I say, weighted blankets is an obvious example. Some children ask for time out, and it's important that we do respect that as well. I feel that as teachers, educators, and as parents, we probably need to be asking children more why they act in certain ways and what we can do to support them in those moments where they feel that they're in crisis. And of course, as we've learned today, older children are our best source of information on what does and doesn't work in an educational context. So I think probably what we're all concluding is that possibly the most important right of a child is their right to be heard. And our goal needs to be proactive in finding ways to make sure that that particular right is realised. And with that in mind, I would like to hand over to Cassandra.
Thank you, Tamara. My name's Cassandra. I'm speaking to you today from Brisbane, Australia. My pronouns are she, her. I have brown hair, I'm wearing glasses and a blue and white striped shirt. I'm in my final year of my Bachelor of Laws. I acquired my disability in 2017, and today I'll be sharing some of my experiences in higher education before introducing the sixth pillar of the roadmap, prevent suspensions and expulsions. My experience at university has overall been very positive. Fortunately, I have had nothing but great support from disability services, providing me with adjustments, as well as being a go-between with teaching staff when required. My experience with disability advisors at university has been excellent. I have not had my disability or my adjustments be doubted or questioned. Outside of disability services, I have unfortunately experienced gatekeeping. For example, I have been strongly asked to consider different opportunities because of my disability, because the opportunity I had chosen did not believe they could support me and didn't want to provide adjustments. Outside of academic support is where I've seen a gap in support, inclusion, and culture, and this is where I have encountered barriers. For example, orientation events in semester 1 this year were not wheelchair accessible. As a result of me raising this issue with the university, I was invited to be a student representative for disability services, to raise student issues like this directly to staff and to be a link between students with disabilities. There can be a disconnect between staff and students, and staff have informally provided feedback that having a direct student link is valuable. It's valuable for students as well, because we can raise concerns and have a voice at a faculty and university-wide level of decision-making that the majority of the student body are otherwise excluded from. Through student representatives, staff are made aware of issues, barriers, and discriminatory policies and practices. As a student representative, I'm able to provide feedback, suggestions, and ideas to benefit students with disabilities. Particularly in the area of disability, having students with lived experience with a disability be included, consulted with, and listened to is crucial. A small group of staff at my university had been asking for the university to endorse the development of a disability inclusion action plan. This year it was endorsed and I was invited to be student co-chair of the working group designing and developing the plan. Our small group consists of staff with disability, staff from key areas and myself as the student voice. We're hoping that this plan facilitates a culture shift around the awareness, understanding and acceptance of disability at university. Having such a high-level strategic document about disability will provide benchmarks and accountability across the university to help realise the right to inclusive education. Since I started my study, I have noticed among the student body a growing positive culture around disability. Students with disabilities now have representation on the representative student body, a community to connect, and multiple student clubs and societies are creating abilities officer roles for students with disabilities to further inclusion. It's essential that people with disabilities and students with disabilities are included in all levels of decision making, and are included in relevant roles at all levels. Myself, other students and staff are working to eliminate the need for such strong advocacy by only a select group of people. For education to be truly inclusive, such a heavy load to realise this right to inclusive education should be borne equally by all. Prevent suspensions and expulsions is the sixth pillar of the roadmap. CYDA's 2019 National Education Survey found that in August and September 2019, 15% of students with disabilities surveyed had been suspended in the last year, and 1.8 were expelled. Students with disability experience suspensions and expulsions regularly in Australian schools, which is a manifestation of the lack of understanding of disability and appropriate available supports. Failure to prevent suspensions and expulsions of students with disabilities will mean that the right to inclusive education will fail to be fully realised. I'd now like to hand over to Cecile to expand further on this pillar.
Thanks very much, Cassandra. And hello, everybody. My name's Cecile Sullivan-Elder, and I'm the Executive Officer of Family Advocacy, a disability advocacy organisation that works across New South Wales, which is a state of Australia. I'm joining you today from Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on all lands that we meet on across the country. As a statewide disability advocacy organisation and residing in the most populated state of Australia, nearly 60% of our calls relate to families seeking advocacy support in relation to barriers experienced when supporting their children into the local school, in essence, an inclusive education. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the suspension and expulsion of students with disability, which is the sixth pillar within the roadmap for change. The suspension and expulsion of students with disability in Australian schools are very much overrepresented, with many students receiving repeated suspensions and in most cases representing the school's failure to appropriately support the student. The student is then used as a scapegoat and seen as the villain, and reinforcing within our system that students with disabilities do not and cannot belong. This of course can lead to the student being expelled, damaging the student's learning, social, and in some cases, future aspirations of a normative life. There are many signposts that lead to why this is the case, and certainly some of these things have been covered already by today's panellist. So what do we want to see in Australia in relation to the use of suspension and expulsion? This is quite simple. The necessary outcome is the elimination of suspension and expulsion across all Australian schools. We realise the elimination of suspension and expulsion will require a paradigm shift along with some key strategies that will enable effective change. And some short-term strategies, we're talking about 1 to 2 years, that we've covered in our roadmap are things such as good quality data. This data would be collected on suspension and expulsions, and it would be needed to be publicly available and reported. This would be an essential first step to enable effective tracking. It would also enable hotspots for the overuse of this practice to be highlighted so that more concentrated efforts can go into addressing this at the local level. The data would also need to track things such as age and sex of student, length of suspension and expulsions, and actions taken to mitigate this. Another short-term strategy required is state and territory policy development to address the whole of school response to required to eliminate the use of suspension and expulsion, with the policy providing guidance and clear expectations for schools across Australia. We also need law, with legislation to be enacted in each jurisdiction to prevent suspension and expulsions of students with disabilities. The accountability of schools is also critical, and families and students being able to navigate a complaint system is essential and currently lacking, with the key to success of this being its independence, completely separate from schools and systems investigating themselves. Currently, as I said, this is not the case, and the matter of urgency around this is critical. The training of teachers and schools is also another essential step in supporting students effectively to mitigate risks of suspension and expulsion. This also includes addressing things such as curriculum adjustments and essential sports for the student. It's also the independent investigation of schools where the students experience more than one suspension, I should say, and the expulsion is considered to ensure compliance at the local school has occurred in relation to policy supports and actions taken. And largely the gap around student voice needs to be captured and put into this transformational change piece, and to feed any kind of redress approaches that we had at improving the system generally. So what does success look like if these strategies are implemented effectively across Australia? In the medium term, we want to see, and we do believe that we'll see a general decreasing of the use of suspensions and expulsions for students with disability, that the independent complaint mechanism has been effective in ensuring school systems are held accountable for reducing suspensions and expulsions, and that these are things such as scorecards, families and students report that it's been effective, they've been heard and their issues have been resolved satisfactorily. And that the culture of schools have changed, and that suspensions are now only considered as a last resort and for the most serious behavioural transgressions. Governments in Australia need to move past the why and need to move to the how. This roadmap and its 6 pillars encapsulates the whole of system reform necessary to transform the current discriminatory system that many students experience. We need some really strong leadership here in Australia, and currently it's lacking, and it's a really critical experience to realise change. So we look forward to working with everybody on here today and all of the other panellists to progressing this in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecile. We've got a few moments for questions. I'd just also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am today in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, which is the Turrbal and Yagara people. And I'd like to specifically acknowledge our first Australians with disability, most especially today, Aboriginal Australian children with disability in the educational system. We've got 2 questions have come through the chat. If any of our attendees have any further questions, please feel free to ask them using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. But first, I'd like to put to our panel the first question, which was the biggest barrier to inclusive education seems to be values and beliefs. Until that is addressed, all the systemic and local barriers that the panellists reported will remain. How do the panellists think that can be addressed?
I think I'd just like to pick up something that Tamara said, and I think responsibility and, as Cecile said, move from the why for inclusive education to the how. Young people, like the young people we've got on the panel today, must be heard and listened to, and we must embed processes for student voice throughout the whole education system, and that must be a right that students are heard in their local schools, and that they are valued equally. So I think, how do we embed student voice and agency across the whole of our educational system, for me, is the big challenge and the big opportunity moving forward.
I just want to say, so Lisa here, so I agree very much that student voice is critical, and it requires actually a power shift that currently isn't seen in schools. I mean, I think we still have lots of historical hangovers about, you know, the place of children in our society, and that's reflected very much in our schools. But I also think the other issue is that while special places exist, we will always see a lack of will to do better in progressing inclusive education. So that's not a position perhaps that I believed 20 years ago, but I have seen so often that while whenever times get tough for schools, that the idea that there is someplace better for students who are seen as other is always going to be the threat that exists. And that's, I guess, a key systemic issue that we need to address, really. And so I think that that issue that students need to be in our schools to be known and valued.
Yeah, and I think I'd probably quickly add to that, it's an intergenerational thing. So we're feeding in, if students are there, they're seen, they're alongside, everybody's together. The next generation, it becomes more common. So it's not a quick fix, but it's one that actually needs some radical change to get that started.
I'd probably, one thing that I'd add there is that we're really talking about a paradigm shift. And I think at the core of that, of the paradigm, the current paradigm is you know, discriminatory practices effectively are sort of cloaked under this history and language of, you know, benevolent paternalism, special places, care and protection. And I think we need to shift from that paradigm into a rights-based paradigm. And it has to be understood that, you know, access to education on the basis of equality and non-discrimination is fundamental for every child. And that's the sort of conversations I think that we sort of need to have in the education space about how to make that happen.
I think also just to add on to what everyone's already said as well, I think it's also about taking the voices of students and young people with disability to the next level by fostering a more collaborative culture between stakeholders in the education sector, between families and between students themselves. And I think it's being able to, I guess, embed the voices of students in the process is the first step, but then it's also being able to take that a step further by being accountable and responsible for the actions and the insights that we've gained from these stories that we hear.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that leaves us with no further time. I'd note there was a second question posed in the chat, which related to whether there's been an attempt or we can work together to proceed with pursuing the federal government over human rights violations in respect of Article 24. Katya has commented in the chat in response to that question, but unfortunately, I'm afraid our time is running out very quickly. So I'd like to thank my name's Emma Phillips and I'm from Queensland Advocacy. I'd just like to thank our wonderful esteemed panel for sharing their thoughts and expertise. I think you'll all agree it was a really wonderful discussion. We are so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with such inspiring leaders, including our incredible young leaders in this area, and to do so within the framework of the broader discussions that were made possible by the United Nations 13th Conference of the State Parties to the CRPD. I'd like to thank Children and Young People with Disability Australia and Mary Sayers in particular for partnering with us and also being a long-term ally in the journey towards implementation of Article 24 in Australia. I'd also like to thank the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Division for Inclusive Social Development, for hosting such a wonderful range of side events alongside COSP 13, including this event. I'd like to thank the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Department of Social Services for supporting the attendance of the Australian NGO delegation at COSP 13 virtually and in person in previous years. And finally, I'd like to thank my wonderful colleagues from Queensland Advocacy Incorporated, Sophie Wiggins and Shannon Bell, for their instrumental work organising this event. In closing, it really does all begin with education. Education is the first formal introduction a child has to a society where he or she will normalise the experience of segregation and exclusion, or alternatively of welcoming and inclusion. The right to an inclusive education in Article 24 of the CRPD acknowledges the vital importance of inclusive education for the full development of human potential and sense of dignity and self-worth, to strengthening respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human diversity, the development of not only mental and physical ability, but also personality, talent, and creativity, and to enable effective participation in society. It is vital that we all, collectively and individually, continue to work towards the realisation of this right. Today, we offer you the ACIE roadmap as a blueprint for driving the change we need to see. Thank you very much.